Spring crept in slowly, leaving pockets of old snow clinging like stubborn ghosts along the fence lines behind Quinn's veterinary care. The muddy gravel lot was half-thawed, boots squelching when Daniel crossed it each dawn, shoulders hunched against the chill that still clung to the air. Shadow padded at his side now, his gait stiff but stronger by the day. His fur had begun to thicken again, scars hidden beneath a growing coat that glowed gold when the sun cut through the clouds just right. Each morning, Daniel rose from the small spare room Walter had given him above the clinic's back office, a room that smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The narrow bed creaked under his tall frame, but the warmth was enough, the soft wool blanket worn thin by years of use, but softer than the cab of his truck had ever been. He still woke before dawn, sometimes startled by old dreams of rattling highways and sharp voices that demanded, "You're late, Harris." But more often he woke to Shadow's quiet whine at the door, a reminder that he wasn't running anymore. Sarah met him on the back porch that first soft morning when the last snow finally melted from the eaves. She held out a chipped mug of coffee, steam curling in the cold air. "You didn't have to clear the yard alone," she said, nodding at the rake leaning against the fence. The small mountain of broken branches and old leaves Daniel had gathered since sunrise. Daniel's mouth twitched in the beginnings of a smile, shoulders rising in a faint shrug. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat alert at his feet, nose twitching at the early morning breeze. "Helps. Keeps my head clear." Sarah tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the same calm in her green eyes that Daniel had learned to trust these past weeks. "We're lucky you're here," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth that settled somewhere deep in Daniel's chest. "He's lucky, too." She nodded at Shadow. The dog leaned into Daniel's leg, pressing his weight there like an anchor. Walter stepped out onto the porch behind them, his old flannel coat pulled tight around narrow shoulders that had carried more years than most men could bear. He cradled a clipboard in one hand, thick fingers curling around the cracked edges. "Sarah's right," he said, his voice carrying the low, patient cadence Daniel had come to listen for. "Place hasn't run this smooth in years." Daniel ducked his head, fighting the heat that crawled up his neck when praise found him unprepared. His stutter still rose to snag the simplest thank you on his tongue, but Walter never minded the silence. Instead, he pointed at the dusty old barn that squatted behind the main clinic building. "Think you're up for helping me patch that old door today?" Daniel's rough palm settled on Shadow's head, ruffling the fur between his ears. "Yes, sir," he managed, the words small but clear. Inside, life found a slower rhythm. Mornings were for chores and patchwork repairs, afternoons for tending the animals, a limp-legged goat brought in by a neighboring farmer, a skittish tabby with an infected eye, an old coonhound whose spine curved like a question mark, but whose tail still wagged with the same stubborn loyalty Daniel saw in Shadow every day. He cleaned stalls, replaced rotted planks, hauled feed from town when Walter's back stiffened too much to lift the sacks himself. Some days he drove Sarah's truck into Silverpine, Shadow curled on the passenger seat, nose pressed to the cracked window as pine trees blurred past. In town, folks began to notice him. At the feed store, Curtis no longer bothered with sharp jabs about Daniel's stutter, at least not out loud. Dave Jensen at the gas stop kept a mug of stale black coffee ready when Daniel stopped for fuel or feed store supplies. They called him the quiet fella Quinn's taken in, a harmless phrase that stuck in the air like dust motes catching morning sun. The old highway still called to him some nights when the wind rattled the shutters upstairs. He'd lie awake, staring at the warped ceiling boards, Shadow's weight curled warm against his shins, listening to the hum of passing trucks on the road beyond the fields. But the pull was softer now, gentled by the solid shape of the life he was building, one plank, one feed bag, one steady breath at a time. It was Sarah who first said it out loud one evening as they sat on the porch steps, shoulders brushing in the fading gold of dusk. Shadow sprawled between them, belly up to the breeze, snoring softly. She nudged Daniel's elbow with hers. "You ever think about staying for good?" she asked. Daniel's chest tightened at the question, not from fear but from the strange, fragile hope that came with imagining something so big, so simple. His mouth opened. The stutter rose up, then softened into silence. Instead, he looked down at Shadow's ribs, no longer sharp against his skin, but padded now with life that hadn't existed weeks ago. He swallowed, the answer sitting heavy and certain on his tongue. Yeah, I did do. Walter watched from the screen door that night, a faint smile hidden under the brush of his white beard. He knew what it meant for a man like Daniel Harris, a man whose whole life had been built on motion, to choose to stay put. Summer came in a hush of slow mornings and heavy air that smelled of wildflowers and pine pitch. By then, the Hammond property raid was weeks behind them, a half-remembered storm of flashing lights and barking dogs, cages pried open, bodies led out into the dawn. Daniel's old photos had turned into statements at the sheriff's office, his halting words backed by Walter's steady ones and Sarah's unwavering stare. The ring was shut down, charges filed, fines and community service for the small players, jail time for the ringleaders. But Daniel didn't think about them much anymore. He thought instead about the rustle of leaves overhead as he fixed fence rails at the edge of Walter's property, about the quiet snort of Shadow dozing in the sun at his feet, about Sarah's laugh from the clinic's back doorway, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she scrubbed old floors back to new. Some nights they sat at the kitchen table long after the animals were settled, Walter nursing a cup of black coffee gone cold, while Sarah leaned her elbows on the scarred oak, tracing plans for a bigger shelter, a side building for strays and abandoned fighters like Shadow. Daniel listened, mouth quiet but mind bright, taking in every word. He learned how the walls went up, how the budget could stretch if you called in enough old favors. Walter showed him ledger books, so old the corners crumbled at his touch. Sarah pressed his rough hands over blueprints spread wide across the table, her fingers brushing his as she pointed out where the kennels would go, where the sun would hit come morning. It was late in August when the first foundation post went into the dry earth behind Quinn's. Daniel's hammer swung steady, each strike ringing across the clearing, scattering birds from the pine boughs overhead. His shirt stuck to his back in the heat, sweat carving pale trails through the dust on his neck. Shadow trotted laps around the perimeter, tail a soft wag that never tired. When the last post stood upright and true, Daniel stepped back, breathless. Sarah pressed a cold can of soda into his palm, her hand warm where it lingered on his wrist. He met her eyes then, really saw them, and for the first time in a long life, full of half-finished sentences and words choked down by fear, Daniel Harris found himself saying something with perfect quiet clarity. "I'm glad I stopped that night." Sarah's answering smile cracked something wide open in him. No road out there could ever carry him farther than that porch step where she stood, where Shadow nosed his leg, where Walter's low hum of an old hymn drifted through the half-open screen door. Long after dusk, when the last hammer was laid down and the sky spilled stars over the ridge, Daniel sat with Shadow's head resting heavy on his knee. He looked up at the dark, breathed deep, and felt the road inside him go still at last, not vanished, but quiet, like an old ghost laid to rest. And somewhere in the hush between the wind and the soft creak of the clinic's porch swing, he found his own voice waiting, patient as the dawn, beaten down by life, by his own faltering voice, by the long stretches of lonely road. Daniel Harris had spent years drifting. But the night he watched Shadow limp through the snow to save a helpless puppy, something shifted. They had saved each other. Winter lingered in Silver Pine. Weeks had passed since that night at the Hammond farm, but the cold air still bit at noses and turned breath to ghostly wisps. In town, people talked about the raid, about the man who'd once been invisible, who stammered when he spoke, who'd risked everything for dogs no one else would have seen. Daniel's name passed from the feed store to the diner, from the truck yard to the small white church that perched on a hill outside town. Some days he still woke before dawn, tangled in half-remembered fears that the world hadn't really changed. But then he'd feel the soft weight of Shadow's head pressed against his chest, the warm puff of breath on his arm, and he'd know they were safe. They were home. The cottage Walter had found for him wasn't much to look at from the road. The porch sagged, the paint was peeling, and the chimney leaned just enough to make Daniel nervous when the wind blew hard. But inside, the old wood stove glowed with gentle heat. There was a battered sofa pushed up close to the fire, and a worn rug where Shadow liked to sprawl, belly up, soaking in the warmth. On the small table by the window sat Daniel's battered notebook, pages filling slowly with careful crooked letters, memories, grocery lists, prayers for the dogs that hadn't made it, hopes for the ones that... Walter came by often. He'd taken to showing up with bags of dog food or a tin of biscuits he claimed his late wife had once baked for church-bake sales. He'd sit stiffly in Daniel's second-hand kitchen chair, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, green eyes bright behind scratched glasses. Sometimes he'd talk about the old days, the years he'd run the vet practice alone before Sarah came home for good. Other times he'd just sit in silence, nodding every so often, as Daniel haltingly found the words he needed to say. Sarah came too, more often than Daniel dared to hope. She'd sweep through his small house in a swirl of quiet purpose, checking Shadow's healing wounds, fussing over his diet, scribbling notes on scraps of paper she'd leave behind for Daniel to find later. Reminders for shots, suggestions for better dog beds, kind little reminders to eat something decent, not just truck stop coffee. She brought warmth with her. Once she'd come by after a long day at the clinic, her braid damp with melted snow, a Tupperware of homemade soup tucked under her arm. Daniel had tried to protest, but she just smiled, that soft, knowing smile that said, "Hush, let someone be kind to you." She'd stayed that evening until the fire burned low, Shadow curled up between them, his head resting in her lap as she read aloud from a battered old paperback she'd pulled from her bag. Daniel had watched her lips move, listened to the gentle rise and fall of her voice, and realized he couldn't remember the last time his house had felt so full. Outside, the world moved on, but for Daniel time had begun to stretch in sweet, small ways. He took to walking the snowy back roads with Shadow at his side, the dog's limp barely noticeable, as he bounded ahead to sniff at tree trunks and fence posts. Sometimes local kids would spot them from their yards and run out in mittens and boots to crouch in the snow, giggling as Shadow pressed his cold nose into their palms. A boy named Eli, a shy 7-year-old with thick glasses and a too-big winter hat, had taken a special shine to Shadow. One afternoon, Daniel found him waiting at the end of his walk, clutching a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich. Without a word, Eli had broken off a piece and held it out. Shadow had licked it from his mittened hand, tail wagging. Eli's mother watched from the porch, calling out a thank you, and Daniel, cheeks burning, just managed to nod, his voice caught tight in his throat. At work, the days were simple but good. The freight company's yard was small but busy, men and women who didn't care how you spoke as long as you hauled the load safe and on time. Daniel found he liked the rhythm of it, the hiss of air brakes, the steady clunk of pallets sliding into place, the quick jokes traded over steaming mugs during cold dawns. When he stammered, nobody laughed. When he fumbled for words, they waited. Sometimes, on breaks, he'd sit in the cab of his truck, notebook propped on the dash, scribbling words that came slow but steady. Once, he'd written a whole page about Shadow, how the dog always found the warmest patch of sunlight to nap in, how his ears perked when the wind rattled the shutters, how he'd stand guard by the door whenever Sarah stopped by, tail thumping, eyes watchful. When the sun set early and the cold deepened, Daniel would light the stove, boil tea in a battered kettle, and watch Shadow doze by the fire. Some nights Walter would appear at the door, Sarah trailing behind him, her cheeks pink from the cold. They'd share bowls of soup, fresh bread wrapped in a clean dish towel. They'd talk about the other rescued dogs, how many had been adopted, how some were still shy but learning to trust again. On the quietest nights, when the wind rattled the old window panes and the world felt smaller than it was, Daniel would sit cross-legged on the rug, Shadow's head in his lap. He'd run his rough fingers through the dog's thickening fur, whispering prayers he didn't always have the words for. Thank you. For him. For them. For this. One night, as spring began to whisper through the frozen trees, Sarah stayed later than usual. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, their shoulders brushing as they watched the moon rise over Silver Pine's rooftops. Shadow sprawled at their feet, his quiet snores mixing with the creak of old boards under their boots. Daniel turned to her, breath fogging in the chill. He opened his mouth once, twice, the words catching in his throat. But Sarah, patient as ever, just waited. I don't know how to say it right, he said finally, voice raw, eyes fixed on the snow-lit yard. But thank you for seeing me. Sarah's smile was soft, her hand slipping into his. You saved him, Daniel, and you saved yourself too. The rest just grows from that. Beaten down by life, once silenced by his own halting voice, Daniel Harris sat with warmth pressed against his side. A loyal dog, a gentle friend, a safe porch under a wide, forgiving sky. He knew now what he'd forgotten in the lonely years. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't crash down like thunder or blaze like lightning. Sometimes they come small, a stray dog who won't stop fighting. A stranger's hand offered at the right moment, a voice that shakes but speaks anyway. So, if you hear this story, carry it with you. When the world slams its doors, keep pushing. When your voice falters, speak anyway. When you see something broken, be the one who stays. Because sometimes hope wears fur and a crooked tail. Sometimes it stands up on shaky legs in the snow and drags the smallest, weakest life back into the light. And sometimes, when you least expect it, you realize that saving someone else was the only way to save yourself too. May you find your miracle. May you be someone's miracle. May you keep the light burning, one story, one soul, one small act of love at a time. If this tale moved you, if you felt the tension, the heartbreak, and the triumph, please support our channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more thrilling, emotional, and inspiring stories your way. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think. Do you believe dogs have an extraordinary sixth sense? Share your thoughts and personal stories with us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.